Las Vegas used to be a small town back in 1905, but now it's the biggest city in Nevada. People might not know that. It's famous for its nightlife, casinos, and attractions, which bring in tourists from all over. Sandra was from Boise, Idaho's capital, but she moved to Las Vegas with her childhood friend. They decided to live together as roommates in a house near a park and the downtown police station, which made them feel safer. Sandra also had a 3-year-old daughter with her boyfriend. To make money, Sandra got a job as a waitress at a popular restaurant called Sambo's Restaurant. Life was going okay for the 25-year-old mom until things took a dark turn. Sandra had no idea that her life would come to an abrupt end on December 26, 1980. Post-Christmas festivity was still in the air, and no one living within the East Las Vegas neighborhood where Sandra resided would have expected a tragedy to occur. Around 9 p.m. on December 26th, Sandra's boyfriend decided to pay her a visit. On arriving at the house, he noticed that it was unusually quiet. He went straight to Sandra's room and was shocked to his core by the sight that greeted him. Lying face up on the bed was Sandra. She was dead and the walls were splattered with her blood. Her agitated boyfriend immediately sprung into action and called the police to report the incident. And in a matter of minutes, police officers from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived. They determined that Sandra had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, and strangled to death. Sandra's daughter, who had gone to stay with her grandparents at the time, had not been around to witness the terrible scene. Sandra's family was devastated when they were given the news of her death. Investigators immediately commenced an investigation. Sandra's roommate was questioned, and she revealed that she had seen Sandra alive barely 2 hours before her death. At the scene of the murder, investigators were able to collect several dark hairs. They had been found on Sandra's stomach and were believed to belong to her killer. Sandra herself was blonde, so the dark hairs stood out. In addition, investigators also got their hands on several other items of evidence, and one of these included a drinking glass containing Kool-Aid. Upon further analysis, a fingerprint was discovered on the drinking glass, and it was not long before a match was found. The fingerprint belonged to a man by the name of Paul Newtall. He was immediately named as a person of interest. The investigation was moving quickly, and it seemed the authorities were making headway. However, they ended up being disappointed. Paul was brought in for questioning, but there was nothing tangible detectives could use to pin him to the murder. As it turned out, Paul was a close friend of Sandra's roommate. According to the roommate's explanation to the detectives, Paul had been at their residence the morning of the murder. She further explained that Paul had asked her to let him sleep in the house because he had nowhere else to go. She had declined, and her reason was that Sandra did not know him well. However, she later invited Paul in to wait for her while she got ready for work. She had told him they would leave together when she left the house. During this time, Paul helped himself to a glass of Kool-Aid. This perfectly explained why his fingerprint had been found on the drinking glass. The roommate also said that after she had gotten ready for work, she and Paul had then left the house. With this revelation, authorities had no choice but to let Paul go. He was deemed an innocent man. The case grew cold. It wasn't until February 2021 that the case would be reopened again. This reopening was prompted by a call from Sandra's daughter to the police department. She had asked for an update about her mother's death, and investigators decided it was high time the case was revisited. Upon a review of that investigation in conjunction with our DNA forensics lab, they were able to determine that there was additional evidence that could, using new DNA technology, Lieutenant Jason Johansson, who had investigated the case, said. The additional evidence that was submitted for testing was DNA that was found under Sandra's fingernails. This DNA had never been tested, and it proved to be the clue detectives needed to crack the case. The DNA was a match to a man, and this was none other than Paul Newtall. From the beginning, detectives had their suspicions about him, but there was nothing they could do since the technology was limited at the time of Sandra's murder. And now, with the strong evidence, authorities knew they finally had him cornered. Paul was eventually arrested on October 27, 2022, at his home in Northwest Valley, Las Vegas. After Paul Newtall was taken into custody, my cold case investigators had the pleasure of making the one phone call that every cold case detective wants to make. Lieutenant Jason said during a news conference after Paul's arrest. "I am hopeful that in some way, shape, or form, this provides some sort of closure for the family," he added. Paul, who is currently 64 years of age, was slammed with charges including murder, sexual assault with the use of a deadly weapon, and burglary while in possession of a deadly weapon. A look at Paul's criminal history revealed that he had not been involved in any other violent crime. However, he had been arrested in the past for felony and drug possession. At the moment, it's still unclear what fate awaits him since his court case is still ongoing. There is also a concern that Paul might have impaired thinking and reasoning ability. Authorities believe that this might hinder him from understanding the charges against him. Due to this, he is being made to undergo a mental health evaluation. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. In 1980, 20-year-old Robin Brooks lived in an apartment on Tally Ho Drive in the beautiful city of Sacramento. Sacramento is a city with a rich history. It has so many nicknames, including the City of Trees. Following the discovery of gold in the area back in the 18th century, gold seekers came in large numbers to mine the precious metal. At present, Sacramento is famous for its extensive and vibrant agriculture. Robin was born in Fort Lee, Virginia, but lived most of her life in Highland, New York. She was carefree, fun-loving, and well-loved by her family. She didn't have fear, not like I had. Maria Eric, Robin's elder sister, had said, "It was more anxious, a little more careful." When Robin was around the age of 19, she decided to move to Sacramento with Maria. She had always longed to experience something new, and moving to Sacramento seemed perfect. In the new city, the two sisters settled in quite nicely. At the time, Maria was romantically involved with a man named Norbert Holston. Norbert was known for his anger issues, and this ugly side of him put a strain on his relationship with Maria. It also affected his relationship with Robin, which contributed to why the two sisters chose to live separately. However, Maria wasn't comfortable with her sister living alone. She worried for her safety, but when she made her concerns known to Robin, it only led to an argument. "I was the older sister and I always felt like I was her protector. When she came out here, she was just having fun. She was 20, Maria said. Robin worked at a donut shop off Kiefer Boulevard, a few blocks from where she lived. Since she had no car, it became routine for her to walk all the way to work and back to her apartment at the end of her shift. Life in Sacramento seemed good, and Robin was enjoying every moment of it, but it wouldn't be for long. On April 24th, 1980, she worked late until around midnight. There was nothing unusual about this since her shift ended around that time. Robin couldn't wait to leave work and go home. Joan Olson, a co-worker at the donut shop, had later said she was joking about having to go home and make her bed before she could crawl into it. She had stripped the bed and done the laundry before she came to work, and she was joking about how it wasn't fair to have to make a bed at bedtime, John had added. As soon as Robin left for work, she made her way to her apartment. That would be the last time she was seen alive by anyone. Robin had a swim date planned with a couple of friends the next day. However, she did not show up for it. Her absence did not go unnoticed. Her shift at the donut shop was slated to begin at 4 p.m., but Robin did not turn up for work. This was quite strange, and her absence worried her coworkers. When she didn't show up, some of them walked over to her apartment to find out what was wrong. On getting there, they discovered that Robin's door was locked. They banged on the door several times and called her name but got no response. Several worrying thoughts began to race through their minds. Had she left town without informing anybody? Was she asleep inside the house? They knew they had to find their way into the apartment to really know if she was inside or not. With the help of the house manager, they soon forced the front door open and stepped into a very silent house. Fearing the worst, they proceeded to the bedroom, and what they saw was too much to take in. Robin Brooks' lifeless body was right in the middle of a punctured waterbed. She had been bound and stabbed to death. It was an unsettling sight. Robin's co-workers wasted no time in letting the police know what had happened, and in a matter of minutes, detectives from the Sacramento Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene. An autopsy revealed that Robin had been sexually assaulted before she was stabbed 5 times. One of the knife blows had pierced her heart. Her killer's DNA was also found in her body. In addition to this, blood was found smeared on the wall of her apartment that was not Robin's. This made authorities infer that the killer had accidentally cut himself while assaulting Robin. Fingerprints belonging to an unidentified individual believed to be the killer were also found on the windowsill of Robin's apartment. This made detectives infer that whoever killed Robin had gotten in through the window. At the time, it seemed this evidence would be enough to quickly bring the killer to justice. That was not the case. Authorities were handicapped by one major challenge. The technology available was not efficient enough to aid them in their investigative work. Due to this, several months and years went by without any progress being made in the case. Robin's killer continued to remain at large. Maria was hit hard by her sister's death. For a long time, she blamed herself for not being there for Robin. She was constantly depressed, and over time she found solace in alcohol. This habit made her spiral downward, and a long battle with alcohol addiction began. In 2004, almost 24 years after Robin's brutal murder, a big break was made in the case. With advanced forensic technology, investigators were able to create a DNA profile of the killer from his blood. This new development gave investigators something more tangible to work with, and they hoped the killer would be caught in time. Several individuals believed to be the suspect's possible relatives were tested, but this yielded no result. Investigators were left even more frustrated than before. Detective Mickey Lynx, who had come out of retirement to dedicate her time to the case, had said in an interview, "It's very frustrating because we have our suspect. We have his DNA and it's a full profile. We know who he is. We just need his name. We need to find who he is." In 2017, the case took an interesting turn. Investigators were able to get an idea of what the killer possibly looked like. This was made possible by a forensic method called DNA phenotyping. The method involves predicting the physical appearance of an unknown individual by using DNA extracted from semen, blood, or other bodily fluid. Can be determined using this process. In Robin's killer's case, authorities were able to create 2 composite sketches. One was of what he would look like at age 25, and the other was of what he would look like at age 56. These 2 profiles were released to the public with the hopes that someone would recognize the killer and come forward with vital information. But authorities were disappointed. Nothing came out of it. The only information authorities got was from an unnamed individual. This information was a different account of what they had initially believed happened on the day of Robin's murder. According to the informant, Robin had not gone home after leaving work. We believe she was at a party that same evening with Hiram Johnson High School students. Sergeant Paul Belly, who worked on this case, said, "This party had taken place at Roseport Way, and after the party, Robin had left for home." While all these revelations were coming to light and the investigation was ongoing, Maria had also gotten her life together. She overcame her alcohol addiction and decided that it was best she lived a life that honored her sister's memory. In 2020, investigators used a DNA search technique called genetic genealogy that helped them get closer to the truth. Genetic genealogy can be used to explore family trees by cross-referencing the DNA profile of an unknown person with that of other people in a public database. This method is very efficient and has been used to bring many elusive criminals to justice. With this method, investigators were able to connect the dots and find Robin's killer. A lab criminalist called Lynx's office line to inform her about the significant discovery, but Lynx couldn't be reached. When Lynx finally called back, the words she was told were, "You found your guy." I literally hung up the phone, and I jumped up and down, and I was clapping my hands, and I ran around the office to tell everybody, Lynx said. She informed Maria, who was also overjoyed by the news. "I was always so afraid he wouldn't be alive. What's a miracle is that DNA. It gives a lot of hope for other people. I never gave up." Maria said, the individual investigators discovered to be Robin's killer was a man by the name of Philip Lee Wilson. Wilson had continued living in Sacramento since the murder. He had been right under the nose of the authorities all the while, but they had no idea. On April 23, 2020, Wilson was arrested at the age of 71 in connection with the 40-year-old murder. He was held without bail and charged with 1 count of murder. Wilson maintained his innocence and the case went to trial. The trial took place nearly 2 years after his arrest. Prosecutors presented evidence that Wilson's DNA was a perfect match to the blood smeared on Robin's apartment wall back in 1980. The fingerprints found on the apartment's windowsill also matched his. According to prosecutors, Wilson snuck into her apartment through a window while she was sleeping. He bound her, sexually assaulted her, and killed her with a knife. Wilson's attorney, Thomas Klinkenbeard, did not dispute that the DNA was Wilson's. However, he argued that Wilson and Robin had known each other and they had consensual intercourse on the day of the murder. Klinkenbeard also gave a reason as to why Wilson's blood had been found in Robin's apartment. The reason he gave was that Wilson had suffered a workplace injury. In addition to all this, Klinkenbeard then blamed Robin's murder on Maria's ex-boyfriend. He described Norbert as a volatile and hot-tempered man whom Maria had been afraid of. He made it known to the court that in the days leading to Robin's murder, both Norbert and Maria had gotten into an argument, and the situation had escalated, with Norbert threatening to kill both Maria and Robin. Klinkenbeard believed that Norbert had lived up to his threat by killing Robin. Well, Maria's testimony rendered this claim invalid. She told the court that Norbert had been with her the night of the murder. Norbert himself was not available to give testimony in court because he had died many years ago. After the trial, which lasted 10 days, the case was reviewed by the jury. On March 9, 2022, which was Wilson's 73rd birthday, they reached a verdict that he was guilty of the murder charge. This decision was made after the jury had initially failed to reach an agreement. More than a month after Wilson was convicted, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Maria was relieved and elated by the news. It was much needed closure after many years. I feel like I can go on with my life now. I think the case absorbed a piece of who I was, Maria said. Lynx was also one of the people happy with the outcome of the case. There is justice in the world, and he will spend all his birthdays now in prison, Lynx had said. I wish we found him earlier, but finally justice has been done, she added. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. The city, named after Benjamin Armistead Shepard, has fewer than 3,000 people. It used to be known for lumbering, but now it's famous for its natural attractions like Lake Livingston State Park and the Big Creek Scenic Area. In 2019, Rhonda lived in Shepard. She worked as a prison guard at the Polanski unit in Livingston for over 20 years and was about to retire. Rhonda was a quiet woman who loved gardening and walking her dogs. She really didn't like snakes, so she always carried a pistol when she was outside. She mostly kept to herself, according to Detective Timothy Keene from the San Jacinto County Sheriff's Office. She often had her dog with her but didn't spend much time with other people. Even though Rhonda was someone who kept to herself, she had a large family that cherished her. At the age of 59, she was a proud mother of 3 children, Trey and Amanda. She also had 5 grandchildren whom she greatly loved. Life was going at a good pace and Rhonda was enjoying every moment of it. But things soon took a dark turn. On May 22, 2019, authorities received a 911 call about a body in the Sam Houston National Forest. This was an area close to where Rhonda lived. 2 men had been riding their quad bikes around the area and had discovered the body. In no time, police officers hopped into their vehicles and were on their way to the scene to see things for themselves. Detective Keene led the team of officers who responded to the emergency call on that day. When the officers got to the heavily wooded area shortly before 4 p.m., they made their way to the location where the body was reported to have been seen. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for. A few meters away from a trail, they came upon an adult female wearing a shirt and jeans and lying face down on the forest floor. The woman was long dead, and from the look of things, she had been that way for a few days. Her body, which was beginning to show signs of decomposition, had been slashed multiple times. When officers looked around the surrounding area, they did not see any sign of struggle. This made them immediately suspect that she had been killed somewhere else and her body had been dumped right where it was found. There were also no other footprints in the surroundings, except for a tire mark that had been made by a quad bike. Apart from this, something else caught the detectives' attention as they found it quite strange. The dead woman was barefoot, but right beside her body were a pair of boots. Detectives immediately knew that the shoes belonged to her. First of all, most folks will not take their boots off in the woods, and second, normally when you take off your shoes or boots, you automatically face them in the same direction as you were facing. It was just odd, Detective Keene said. Immediately, we grew suspicious of the nature and the cause of death due to the way she was found, and the way her body was basically mutilated. She was found face down. She was scalped, said Detective Gary Sharpen, one of the officers who discovered the body. The body was soon sent to the Southeast Texas Forensic Center for autopsy and identification. When the body was identified, it turned out to be Rhonda. Authorities immediately contacted her family and gave them the news of her death. They were devastated. By May 24, 2019, the result of the autopsy was out. However, there was a problem. The level of decomposition of her body made it difficult for medical examiners to pinpoint what had really caused her death. There was no sign that she had been sexually molested. However, on closer inspection, drops of blood were found on her shirt, jeans, and undergarment. Since there were various slashes on her body, it was apparent where the blood had come from. Apart from this, it was also discovered that she had been hit on the head and face with an unknown object. These discoveries were, in a way, significant, but detectives were not entirely satisfied. They knew that if progress was to be made with the investigation, more details were needed. An agreement was soon reached for a second autopsy to be conducted on Rhonda's body. This time around, detectives sought the help of an anthropologist by the name of Dr. John Bithway to carry out this second autopsy. While this was going on, detectives began to look at other angles. A thorough search of Rhonda's profile was conducted, and it was discovered that she worked at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice as a prison guard. This immediately caught the attention of detectives. They speculated that Rhonda might have been targeted by someone from her place of work, particularly an inmate. It was not uncommon for such things to happen, and detectives knew that having a look at Rhonda's place of work might just give them the answers they needed. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice was immediately contacted to launch an investigation into the prison system where Rhonda had worked. Several of her co-workers were interviewed, as well as some of the prison inmates, but all of these turned up nothing. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. When detectives realized that Rhonda's workplace might have nothing to do with her death, they decided to direct their attention somewhere else. By this time, the result of the second autopsy was ready. Just like the first autopsy, detectives were unable to gather enough helpful information. However, the second autopsy revealed that Rhonda had been sexually assaulted and then killed afterwards. The slash marks that were also found covering her body were believed to have been inflicted after she had died. Whoever had killed her had also made sure not to leave his DNA behind, and this made things even more difficult for detectives. There was absolutely nothing tangible they could work with. They soon realized that interviewing as many people as they could was a sure way to get meaningful information. They started with Rhonda's family. From talking to Rhonda's family, detectives were made aware of Rhonda's dislike for the woods as well as snakes. They were also told that it was common for her to carry a pistol whenever she was out mowing her lawn. With this piece of information, detectives knew that it was unlikely that Rhonda had ventured out on her own to the area where she had been found dead. But since there was no surveillance footage of the area, they couldn't know for sure. It was all beginning to look hopeless. A search of Rhonda's house didn't reveal much either, but detectives were able to locate her pistol inside the house. However, no matter how detectives looked at the case, nothing made any sense to them, Detective Keene said. Everyone seemed to like her. She was not into drugs. She was just living a normal life. There was no hidden gold mine. Detectives began to interview and question her neighbors since there was a likelihood that one of them had seen and knew what she was up to moments before her death. From these series of interviews, detectives were able to discover something they had not known before. According to the accounts given by several witnesses, Rhonda's dog had run off into the woods a few days before she was found dead. It was not the first time her dogs had run off like that. Rhonda, who had been agitated by this, had then sought the help of her neighbors to help find the dogs. Only one person had allegedly volunteered to help her, and this was a man by the name of Robert Clary. The two had then gotten on Robert's quad bike, and they had driven off into the woods. That was the last anyone saw of Rhonda. Detectives also got to find out that Robert was not a stranger to Rhonda, and his house was only a short distance away from hers. Soon after finding out all this, detectives went ahead to question Robert. He was now a person of interest in the case, and they needed to know if he had any involvement with Rhonda's death. When Robert was questioned, he did not deny knowing Rhonda. He told detectives that he was aware that she had been out looking for her runaway dogs. However, he denied that he had gone with her to look for them. This was contrary to the account given by eyewitnesses. But since detectives had no proof that he had been with her on the day she was last seen, there was nothing they could do. Along the line, detectives also became aware that Robert had been one of the two men that had found Rhonda's body in the woods. The other men had been Robert's nephew. According to what they also found out, Robert had been reluctant to inform the police about Rhonda's body. This was because he feared that police would consider him a suspect since he knew and lived close to her. So he had instead gone ahead to tell his family about the discovery. At some point, Robert had also returned to where Rhonda's body was and taken photographs of it. His nephew had been the one that had finally made the phone call about the body. When all of this got out in the open, detectives found it all very strange. It's not clear at what point in the investigation they got to find out or how exactly they found out, but it was enough for them to grow even more suspicious of Robert. An arrest warrant was out of the question because detectives were not entirely certain that the evidence they had was completely valid. Most of what they had was based on the words of other people and was circumstantial at best. This is a difficult case. We have evidence, a lot of evidence, but a lot of it is circumstantial. And we have to be 110% sure of exactly what happened before we issue any arrest warrants. Detective Keene had told the media during the investigation. Detectives eventually obtained a warrant to conduct a search on Robert's property. When detectives got to his residence, which was a travel trailer that was fenced in, they immediately showed him the warrant. He did not resist and welcomed them in. Upon entering, detectives noted that the living space was generally dirty and needed a serious makeover. However, when they entered the kitchen, they were immediately hit with the strong smell of bleach. The kitchen itself was very neat when compared to other parts of the house. Detectives found this odd. They were able to locate a container of bleach on the kitchen counter. It looked like someone did a hasty cleanup job at some point. But once again, cleaning your kitchen isn't against the law, Detective King said. Much to the detectives' disappointment, a thorough search of the house eventually yielded nothing. Robert's vehicle was also searched, but detectives could not find anything that seemed out of place. In the end, they left, but not without taking along with them a rug that had been inside the house, as well as Robert's quad bike. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office Crime Lab was contacted to carry out an analysis on the items, but after conducting the analysis, nothing tangible came out of it. Detectives soon enlisted the support of the U.S. Forest Service Investigative Unit, as well as the FBI. All units viewed the case from different angles, but they could not make head or tails of it. Robert remained a prime suspect, but all the evidence they had against him was not solid enough. Soon the investigation began to fizzle out, and the case went cold. Days turned into months, and in the blink of an eye, 3 years had gone by. Rhonda's death remained a mystery, but authorities never gave up. Detective Gary, who worked on the case, knew that to successfully solve it, there was a need to bring in new and more capable people on deck. He weighed his options and realized that veteran prosecutor Kelly Siegler would be a great addition to the team. Kelly was a former prosecutor for Harris County, and during her time there, she prosecuted more than 200 cases, of which 68 were murders. After the end of her prosecutorial career, She focused on an investigative real-life crime series known as Cold Justice. This allowed her to work alongside investigators to reopen and solve several murder cases. When Detective Gary and another detective by the name of Omar Sheikh contacted Kelly about Rhonda's murder case, she obliged and joined in the investigation. This time around, detectives were determined to solve the case once and for all. They spent hours looking at past evidence and also took time to re-interview past witnesses. But they only ended up going around in circles. As a last resort, detectives decided to use cell phone data to help them solve the case. Experts in the field of digital forensics and pathology were brought on to help with this, and work began immediately. This was around October 2022. Detectives started by figuring out the coordinates of Rhonda's cell phone around the time that she was last seen alive. Coordinates from Robert's cell phone were also analyzed, and just as detectives expected, it placed him on the trail where Rhonda's body was found. Detectives were overjoyed by this finding, because they knew solid evidence was finally available. From there, things even got more interesting. A witness came forward and gave detectives some very vital information. It's not clear who this witness was or what kind of information they provided, but their testimony further strengthened the evidence detectives had. We happened to cross a witness in this case that we knew was out there, but we had never been able to identify or locate. We happened to cross this witness, and it really was just the last piece of the puzzle we needed to get a warrant. San Jacinto County Criminal District Attorney Todd Dillon said to the media on October 31, 2022, Robert was arrested and charged with the murder of Rhonda. He was held at San Jacinto County Jail on a $750,000 bond. A look at Robert's past revealed that he was not a stranger to the law. Between 1990 and 1994, he was arrested on 4 occasions for DWI. This means driving while intoxicated or impaired. In 1994, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison after his 4th arrest for DWI. Then on June 21, 2003, he was arrested for a similar crime and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. After his release, he again got into trouble with the law the year of 2007. This time around, it was for indecency with a child. For the crime, he received a 5-year jail sentence. At the moment, it's not yet clear what his motive was for allegedly killing Rhonda, but his arrest has brought some sort of comfort to her family. For 15 years, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office tried to catch a killer. Oscar Tejeda Maya was the main suspect in Arturo Martinez Altamirano's murder in 2007, but it took a long time before they could arrest him. On October 29, 2007, hunters found Arturo's body along West Grove Road. They told the PCSO right away, and the investigators started looking into the 37-year-old man's murder. There wasn't a clear reason for the crime, but there was DNA evidence and the name of a possible suspect, Oscar Tejeda Martinez. Witnesses said they saw Arturo and Oscar together before the murder. Even though the police knew who they were looking for, Mejia got away and left the country before they could catch him. Over the years, the case went cold. Then in 2017, the homicide department reopened it when they found out Mejia was living in Mexico. The next year, they got a DNA sample from someone who was said to be close to the suspect. Through testing, detectives were able to positively match and link Mejia to the murder of Arturo. Working together, U.S. Marshals and Interpol located and arrested Mejia on January 12, 2022. Mejia, who was 59 years old at the time of his arrest, was a Mexican citizen. He was extradited to the U.S. and faces a first-degree murder charge. Pinal County Sheriff Mark Lamb said it was their duty to make sure violent criminals were not permitted to live freely while their victims' families suffered. We are hopeful this will bring some peace to those who have waited so long for closure, he said. For 17 years, the mystery of Pertina Epps' murder baffled authorities until DNA evidence linked a popular schoolteacher to the crime. The 21-year-old mother of 2 was found strangled to death in an empty carport in Gardena, California. Her body was discovered by a resident of the apartment complex as they were backing out of the parking lot. She had just moved back from San Diego the day before, on April 25, 2005. Epps was alleged to have been a sex worker and was initially believed to be the victim of a serial killer. There was a fingerprint found on a purse belonging to Pertina, along with some DNA evidence. Yet neither yielded a match in police databases. Despite following up on tips and an extensive investigation into the murder, all leads were exhausted. That is, until the DNA evidence found at the crime scene was retested after Epps' case was reopened in 2021, revealing a completely new suspect. On January 27, 2022, police arrested Charles Wright, a 57-year-old math and history teacher at Monroe Middle School. His bail was set at $1 million. Following the arrest of Wright, County Administrator and head of Englewood Unified School District, Erica F. Torres, announced to parents and staff that he would no longer be teaching at any of their schools. Wright resigned from teaching after 20 years in order to focus on fighting the case. He remained adamant about his innocence, claiming the fingerprint evidence that linked him to the murder was probably due to his sideline business of selling clothing and purses from his car. Wright told investigators that if they asked anyone, they would tell them he was known to sell items from his car during the time of Epps' murder. A student who wanted to remain anonymous said they didn't believe the charges against him were real. Mr. Wright is one of those teachers that keep it real with you and looks out for students, always encouraging us to take life and our studies seriously, said the student. However, shortly after posting bail, his DNA was linked to yet another sexual assault case in 2006, a year after Epps' murder. The victim was an 18-year-old woman known to be a sex worker in the Los Angeles area. He appeared in court on the first-degree murder charge with regard to the Epps case. He pleaded not guilty to the charges leveled against him in that case. Wright, though, was arrested once again, this time being charged with both cases, and his bail was revoked. Epps' mother, who has not been named, said she hoped that this time they found the right person. Investigators strongly believe that Wright may be responsible for other incidents and urge victims to come forward with more information. In the description box, it was a murder that shocked and shattered the innocence of Bedford, Massachusetts. When Raymond Shubin returned home from work on June 10, 1971, his perfectly ordered life was torn apart. In the basement, he discovered the beaten and bloodied body of his wife, Natalie. Raymond immediately called police and investigations began in earnest. A 54-year-old mother of 2 grown children was found bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Her ankles were bound, a gag hanging around her neck, and her body lay face down in the basement of her Pine Hill Road home. Police initially looked at her husband Raymond, who was the president of Lexington Trust Bank. He was cleared as a suspect after providing a solid alibi. An autopsy revealed she had been stabbed fatally and beaten over the head with an unknown blunt object. At the crime scene, police recovered blood from a bathroom sink and lifted a partial fingerprint. Apart from Natalie's 1969 Chevy Impala, nothing of importance had been stolen. Only a paring knife and pry bar, which was likely used to beat Natalie, were missing from the home. The master bathroom was disturbed by the killer. The closet and several purses were rifled through, possibly in search of items of value. The car was later discovered in the parking lot of Bedford Veterans Administration Hospital. However, the interior had been wiped clean, leaving no evidence apart from a partial fingerprint. The violent death of the well-known and respected Natalie Shublin sent shockwaves through the small community. One resident, Maureen Sullivan, remembered being a carefree 14-year-old at the time. The places they used to play all year round were suddenly off limits. The investigation was long and drawn out, with police searching the woods behind the home. Hundreds of surveys were distributed among the community, with people being asked if they had seen anything unusual that afternoon. Recently released prisoners from the local jail and patients and staff from the local VA hospital were checked and cleared. This included 4 patients who escaped the hospital. All leads were exhausted by the end of the investigation, as none of them panned out. For years, the case went cold as police were unable to identify a suspect. Technological advancements would take years before finally delivering investigators a name. Automated fingerprint identification was used by state police to run the fingerprint lifted from the crime scene. In 1999, the police finally had a name: Arthur Louis Massai. He was someone the police wanted to look into regarding the case. Massai, though, proved a cunning foe. When investigators initially interviewed him, he denied knowing Natalie or anything about her murder. Eventually, he told investigators he'd been asked by an organized crime associate to murder the wife of a banker and make it look like a break-in. Masai claimed he turned down the offer. Police could not find any evidence to corroborate Masai's claims. Furthermore, they found no link between Masai and Raymond Shubin involving a plot to have Natalie murdered. During a 2005 follow-up interview with police, Masai shifted the blame onto one of his cousins. He alleged that he'd learned his cousin had carried out the murder. Speaking to police, Masai provided a detailed outline of how the murder had happened. Far from clearing his name, this revelation to more police scrutiny of Masai's story. Yet it was not enough to secure an arrest. The case again went cold and would stay cold for the next 20 years. Meanwhile, Raymond Shubler passed away, aged 92 in 2012, never knowing the truth behind his wife's murder. It was looking as though their children, Kenneth and Carol, too, may also go to their graves without answers. That's when Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan and the Cold Case Unit refocused their efforts in the Shublin case. Approaching the case from a new angle provided some much-needed clarification, proved to be the pivotal point in turning the case in their favor. Investigators identified a woman who has not been named that admitted to being involved with Masai in schemes to defraud banks during the 1990s. She also revealed his weapon of choice. Masai habitually carried a knife and even bragged about killing someone with one. Further digging into his past revealed a lengthy criminal history. Masai had prior convictions for armed robbery, financial crimes, and assault and battery. For the prosecution team, this was enough to take to a grand jury. It was the link and corroboration they needed to back up the facts they already had. During the arraignment, Prosecutor David Soleil argued that Masai showed a disdain and general disregard for the law and the justice system. They addressed Masai's long criminal history. These include prison sentences, assaults on correctional officers, and 2 prison escapes. As recently as 2016, Masai violated a court order for harassment and abuse. Soleil told the court that Masai would not abide by the court's orders and should therefore be held without bail. After half a century, a grand jury finally indicted Masai on the first-degree murder charge. He was 76 years old and living in Salem, Massachusetts at the time of his arrest on March 22, 2022. Masai's estranged daughter, Candace Moran, spoke out about her father's arrest. She had been born just weeks before the murder. According to Moran, she had not spoken to Masai since 1991. "If it's true, it's absolutely disgusting," she said. She felt absolutely sorry for the family of Natalie and said it was shocking to hear that her father had committed such a brutal crime just 2 weeks before she was born. Natalie's children, who are now in their 70s, watched the arraignment remotely. He pleaded not guilty and is being held without bail. Bedford Police Chief Ken Fung hopes that the arrest provided some closure and a sense of justice for Natalie's family. "I'm hopeful that the arrest in this case today will provide some closure and sense of justice for Natalie Shublin's family." For 30 years, Noka Irvin was haunted by the memory of discovering her sister Helen's body at a YMCA room in Niles, Illinois. 35-year-old Helen Cardwell had been living at the YMCA after suffering a stroke a year earlier. She had moved from West Virginia to seek treatment and help. She was undergoing rehabilitation and was about to start her life anew when it was tragically snatched from her. It was November 7, 1992. Helen was preparing to start a job at the Lutheran General Hospital in Park Ridge, sterilizing medical equipment. When Noka stopped by at the Leaning Tower YMCA to pay Helen a visit, she didn't expect the horror that was about to greet her. Helen was naked apart from a pair of white socks. She had been tied up and strangled with a sweater that was still around her mouth. It appeared she was sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. There was no sign of forced entry and nothing was stolen. Residents didn't notice anything unusual or suspicious the night before. There seemed to be no evidence of a visible struggle in the room. Niles police followed up on all clues and interviewed everyone in the YMCA building. What little evidence there was collected and bagged until further testing could be done to find Helen's killer. Helen Cardwell was struck down in the prime of her life before she could embark on a journey to start afresh with a new job. Her killer, it seemed, had got away with murder. For 3 decades, the case grew progressively cold. It was long enough for police to decide that Helen's family needed justice for her untimely death. In 2020, Niles Police Department reopened the investigation, and the cold case team took another look at the evidence collected. Technology had improved significantly since 1992, and the biological evidence found on Helen's body and the sweater were submitted to the national database, CODIS. In November 2021, there was a hit. It belonged to 72-year-old Richard Sisto. Sisto had no connection to Helen apart from the fact that he worked just blocks away from the Leaning Tower in Village Crossing. Police were further baffled as to how Sisto went undetected while attacking Helen at her YMCA room. Sisto, though, was no stranger to crime. Until 1992, he was incarcerated in Texas for a 1977 aggravated sexual assault case. He was accused of sexually assaulting a female prison guard in 1984. He was released on parole in April 1992 and was working at the Toh Avenue Jewel Osco store during the time when he attacked and murdered Helen Gardwell. When police made the link to Helen's murder through DNA evidence testing, police initially could not find Sisto. He was being held in Harris County, Texas on a parole violation. When they finally tracked him down, he was interviewed and a DNA sample was taken, proved to be a positive match. Sisto was extradited to Illinois to face murder charges in relation to the slaying of Helen Cardwell. He was held on a $1 million bond before being extradited back to Illinois. On November 23, 2021, Sisto was ordered by Judge Anthony Calabrese to be held without bond during his hearing at the Cook County Courthouse. Detective Mike Boba of the Niles Police Department said, "It was something that has been in their heads, and it was frustrating at the time." For Noka Irvin, the arrest comes with a great sense of relief, as her sister's killer was finally caught. "I'm so grateful they decided to reopen this case, and I just appreciate everyone's efforts in solving her murder," she said. At the time of his arrest, Sisto had been diagnosed with a heart condition. He ultimately passed away on January 26, 2022, while awaiting trial. Within half an hour of saying goodbye to his wife, Terry Wood's life changed forever when he discovered her body lying in a pool of her own blood in their kitchen. 31-year-old Roxanne Lee Wood and her husband, Terry, lived together for 2.5 years on Tam O'Shanter Lane in Niles, Michigan. They did not have any children, but were making plans to start a family together. Roxanne worked in the customer service department at Automatic Molded Plastics in South Bend, Indiana. She was affectionately known as Rock to those closest to her. She adored tending to her rose bushes. Family and friends described her as outgoing and said she loved to laugh. On the night of February 19, 1987, Roxanne and Terry went out to the White's Bowling Lanes on 11th Street in Niles. She left the place at around 12:30 a.m., driving home alone. She and Terry had taken separate cars, and he left a little later. At 1 a.m., when Terry eventually arrived at their home, he discovered Roxanne covered in blood, throat slit. There were no signs of forced entry, save for the rear door that was left slightly ajar, an empty knife sheath laying next to her body. When police arrived and investigations began, it was deduced that Roxanne had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. A post-mortem revealed her throat had been slit after her death. Divers searched the nearby Brandywine Creek following Roxanne's murder, looking for the weapon, but nothing was found. The murder weapon was never recovered, but police believe that a fillet knife from the couple's own kitchen was used to kill Roxanne. Local newspaper, the South Bend Tribune, reported that Roxanne had been struck on the head with a frying pan found nearby. She was hit with such force that the handle had broken off the pan. Police first had to interview the spouse, Terry. In incidents such as this, the spouse is always considered a person of interest. DNA evidence collected from the scene included 2 vials of dried blood. In April of the same year, Terry would put up a reward for $15,000 to anyone who could provide information in identifying the killer. Unfortunately, this did not garner any fruitful leads and the case grew colder as the years passed. Terry remained the state's prime suspect despite his claim of innocence. These suspicions were fueled by the hiring of an attorney who advised Terry to exercise his right to remain silent in regard to Roxanne's case. Terry would live under a cloud of suspicion as there were no other leads in the case for nearly 14 years. In 2001, DNA taken from the scene was tested against samples given by Terry. The DNA found at the scene was not a match, and this left investigators with more questions than answers. Terry being cleared was both a relief and a new set of problems. Now it meant starting the investigation process from scratch. They began by interviewing over 200 people, but they were no closer to finding the killer in 2001 than they were in 1987. The DNA sample was entered into Cody's, but still no match was found. The case remained cold until criminal justice students from the Western Michigan University, under the guidance of Dr. Ashley Kirsten, identifinders, and the Michigan State Police, teamed up to find the killer. Students Ashley Shebeck and Carl Huber put in over 1,200 hours of their time in scanning and digitizing multiple boxes of evidence. The cold case program was spearheaded by Dr. Kirsten, and Roxanne's case was the first to be investigated by her team of students. The documents were made easily accessible and allowed detectives to browse through files and develop profiles using specific names, dates, and keywords. Using character recognition software, data was compiled to create profiles of potential persons of interest based on personal traits and characteristics. Armed with a character profile, detectives now needed a DNA profile. Identifinders tested the 2 dried blood samples to narrow down a genetic profile of the possible killer. They decided to try using genetic genealogy, a more modern and advanced method of testing DNA using genetic profiles from relatives of possible suspects. It was Gabriela Vargas, an investigative genetic genealogist who had been working as a consultant with Identifinders International, who ended up cracking the case. Literally, a case that took them 34 years to investigate took me 4 days to solve, she said proudly. It was a landmark discovery for DNA testing, as the decades-old sample was considered very low-level and highly degraded. A nod toward the major strides made in technology in helping identify a killer that would have gotten away with a crime. Prior to Vargas handling the testing, 2 other genealogy agencies gave up on the case, calling it unsolvable. She started the process of DNA matching using family trees. Once she found the right family, it was the process of eliminating possible suspects. They found 3 possible matches. All 3 were brothers, and one of them was the man they were looking for, Patrick Wayne Gillum. Of the 3 brothers, Patrick was the only one who had a criminal history and lived near Roxanne at the time she was murdered. Detectives knew that Gillum was a smoker, and after some undercover work, were able to recover a cigarette butt and test for DNA match. The match was positive, and police prepared to make the arrest. Mere days before the 35th anniversary of Roxanne's death, police arrested Gillum, now 67 years old, on February 17, 2022 at his South Bend home in Indiana. Initially, details of his identity were not released to the public, as investigators waited for him to be arraigned on the charges. Authorities did reveal, however, that the killer had no connection to Roxanne. At a press conference held on February 18, 2022, Berrien County Prosecutor Steve Pierre Engley announced the identity of Roxanne Lee Wood's killer as Patrick Wayne Gillum. Gillum was previously charged and arrested in Gary, Indiana, for breaking into a home and attacking Maureen Farag. She ultimately survived the attack, and Gillum was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He only served 7 years, half his original sentence, before brutally killing Roxanne just 6 months after his release. He lived just 4 miles away from Roxanne when the murder was committed. Maureen's husband, Robert Farag, supported the Woods family at Gillum's sentencing in April 2022. "I just hope he doesn't see the light of day. He doesn't deserve it," said Farag. For Roxanne's family, they were relieved to finally get some answers to the questions that had plagued them for 35 years. They characterized him as a predator, whose actions have haunted their family for decades. Brad Wood, Roxanne's brother, never gave up on finding justice for his sister. During Gillum's sentencing, Roxanne's family were given a chance to speak. Wood said his voice would be heard if Gillum was ever released early for murdering Roxanne. "He is a monster and should never be allowed to walk the streets where my wife, my daughters, and my granddaughters walk free," he said. Roxanne's younger sister, Janet Wood, said that Gillum's action gave her entire family a life sentence, while he got to live life as a free man for far too long. By the grace of God and the right detectives and modern technology, he was found and we are here today to see him finally pay something for what he's done, which is likely the rest of his life in a cage, like the violent animal that he is," she said. Gillum was allowed to address the family after they had their say in court. He expressed remorse for his actions and the devastation he caused for both the family of the victim and his own. "I'm very sorry. I can't believe I did what I did. I pray for them every night. I am so sorry. I just hope sometime in the future, with God's help, that they can forgive me. And to my family that I'm sorry I disgraced." "I'm so sorry," said Gillum. In an interview with WBST-TV, Janet voiced her anger at what had happened to Roxanne. "I lost a best friend, a lifelong best friend." During his sentencing, Gillum pleaded no contest to the charge of second-degree murder and was given a minimum sentence of 23 years. He will likely spend the rest of his life in prison, as he will be 90 before he serves his minimum sentence. St. Lucy's, with its gorgeous beaches, varied waterways, and rich heritage sites, showcases the best of Florida's beauty. Spanning 688 square miles, St. Lucie County was known for its lovely communities where families could thrive. However, everything changed after a terrible crime shook this peaceful place. Laura's parents, Jose Luis Navarro Weiser and Judy Marie Weiser, besides Laura, had 4 other children. Jose served in the United States Armed Forces while Judy looked after their family. Laura grew up in a pleasant home in St. Lucie County, Florida. Described as spirited and outspoken, Laura was only 11 years old in 1983, attending 6th grade at Chester Amore Elementary School when tragedy struck. On Sunday, November 6, 1983, around 1:30 p.m., Laura was last seen near Midway Road and Okeechobee Road in Fort Pierce, St. Lucie County, Florida. She had spent the previous night at a friend's house and was returning home with a stack of clothes in her hands, just within sight of her family's driveway, when she was last spotted. Without anyone knowing how, the little girl vanished into thin air. Worry set in for Laura's family when she did not return home that afternoon as planned. Her parents called the friend Laura had been with, but they were informed that Laura had left hours ago. Panic-stricken, they quickly searched the area but couldn't find her. They then went to the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office to report her missing. Authorities did not take reports of missing adolescents seriously until they had been missing for a longer period. In their words, adolescents who did not return home on time were often playing with their friends and had simply lost track of time. This miserable strategy from law enforcement obviously forced Laura's parents to helplessly wait for their daughter to show up at home, which she never did. A bolo sheet, however, was put out for Laura after the family insisted that she would never go anywhere on her own. Unfortunately, authorities never implemented a large-scale search in the initial phase of the investigation. Soon, a piece of information regarding Laura came to the light. A deputy from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office, James Howard Harrison, came forward saying that he saw the girl walking near a gas station, close to her home. He had been on patrol in the same area on the day Laura went missing. That was the last time anyone saw Laura alive, ever again. On November 9, 1983, 3 days after Laura went missing, her family received the news they feared the most. Her 90-pound lifeless body had been found in a drainage ditch of what was then called the Dunn Citrus Grove near Midway Road and Shin Road, approximately 600 yards from the intersection where she was last seen walking. Her body was taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. According to the report, she had been murdered on the same day she went missing. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death in a disgusting act of sheer brutality. Laura's family was devastated at her demise, and they were upset at the half-hearted efforts of the local authorities. They could not wrap their heads around the fact that the police had never even bothered to start a large-scale search for Laura. At the same time, their small neighborhood was shocked at this brutal crime, but it was too late for any explanation. And people wanted nothing more than to find the murderer who chose this little girl as their prey. However, sadly for them, decades would pass before the mystery could be unraveled. There were not many clues to follow. A brief investigation ensued and detectives did a couple of interviews but could not gather any evidence to lead to a conviction or even apprehension. Soon, the case went cold and remained so for 4 decades. Years later, in 2020, the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated cold case squad, and Laura Ann's cold case was selected for the team to reinvestigate along with a few other cases. Detective Paul Taylor was in charge of the investigation. Although Taylor had no personal relation to the deceased girl, he took a special interest in this case. In a press conference, he later shared that he somehow did relate to the little girl's story after losing his only son to suicide. He even saw his son and Laura in a dream, which he considered an indication to keep digging through the mystery. Keeping a picture of Laura on his office desk, he promised himself to never give up on this little girl. As a part of the investigation, Taylor traced his way back in time, speaking to the witnesses as well as the original investigators. His investigation led him to one of their own who had never been on their radar, but was a part of the original investigation. The suspect was none other than the former St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office deputy, James Howard Harrison. Yes, you heard it right. He was the last person to see Laura alive. As he dug deeper into the evidence, Detective Taylor discovered many holes in the original investigation. Not only had Harrison last seen Laura, but he was also the one who reported the discovery of Laura's body. However, he was not the one who discovered it. 2 men were working at Citrus Grove when they noticed a lifeless body of a little girl and reported it to the patrol officer in the area, Harrison. After Taylor talked to one of them, the man described the incident as deeply traumatizing. However, he could still remember the crime scene in great detail. Taylor was shocked to learn that his description did not match what was in the case file. The man further told him that Harrison asked them to immediately leave after they reported the discovery to him. This seemed strange, but what had been stranger was that no one else wanted to talk to them further after that. Taylor was the first detective who talked to him after Harrison. Harrison spent 20 minutes with Laura's corpse before the other officers joined him. For the first time, there seemed to be a suspect in the murder of Laura and Heuser, and it was someone they could have never predicted. As the connection was made, Detective Taylor began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. The question had always bothered him as to why Harrison did not give the girl a lift. In any normal situation, even back then, a law enforcement officer who saw a little girl carrying a bundle of clothes would have assumed she was a runaway and would have stopped to at least talk to her or would have driven her home. Detective Taylor and his team theorized that Harrison moved the girl's body into the drainage ditch where she was found to get rid of potential evidence before the backup arrived. It was time for authorities to look at Deputy Harrison more closely for the first time. Supposedly, he had complaints brought forward from within the sheriff's office as co-workers felt he had been inappropriate with young women while conducting his duties as a deputy. Aside from his job in law enforcement, he also worked as a preacher in the region. Even in that job, he couldn't keep his dignity intact. Several accusations had come forward that Harrison had molested young girls at his job at Bethel Baptist Church in the city of Fort Pierce. Detective Taylor uncovered proof of Harrison tampering with evidence, moving things at the crime scene, and hindering the investigation. Despite this checkered past, he was never charged. He was just kicked out of the church, and he himself resigned from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office in 1984, just 5 months after Laura's homicide. As nobody kept any tabs on him and he was never formally charged, he just picked up his family and left, like nothing had ever happened. Over the years, he moved around a lot and worked with 10 different law enforcement agencies in his entire career. Every time he started over, he took advantage of his position and maintained access to the potential victims. Sheriff Ken J. Mascara, who used to work with Harrison, said that he voiced concerns about Harrison's inappropriate interactions with young people. These complaints did not go anywhere at the time he made them. Around 1979 or 1980, with all this new information, Detective Taylor went forward to gather more conclusive evidence. In 2021, analysts at a private DNA lab were able to recover the DNA from the sexual assault of the victim, which suggested that the suspect was male. But it was degraded too much by the time they were able to compare the DNA samples. Due to the extreme degradation, forensic analysts could not get a 100% match. Although no conclusive DNA evidence could be found, detectives decided that there was enough probable cause and circumstantial evidence to consider Harrison responsible for Laura's murder. "We have established probable cause to determine that Harrison abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered the juvenile victim," said Chief Deputy Brian Hester in a press conference in February of 2022. Unfortunately, Harrison would once again elude justice by dying from cancer in 2008. The Wazir family was in disbelief at how the layers of this cold case had unfolded. "It naturally was like a disbelief, a dream," Laura's older brother, Joe Wazir, stated. "After all this time, you're telling me you're able to tell us who murdered our little sister?" Sadly, Laura's parents would never see this day. Her mother passed away in 2007, and her father soon followed in 2009. Laura's remaining family was grateful to Detective Taylor for cracking this case, especially since nobody expected it. Several police departments around the state are now checking their own cold cases because they believe there were other victims. Ironically, where one police officer put all his efforts into helping people, the other abused his power to commit the crime. But at least in the end, the truth won. Snohomish County has a lively past rooted in logging and farming. After World War I, agriculture, dairy farming, and shingle mills were big sources of income. Even after World War II, Arlington remained a typical small town, where logging and farming were key ways of making a living. Life went on as usual until the 1960s, when the population suddenly grew by over 400%. Our story takes us back 40 years to this bustling time, where a teenage boy made a startling discovery. It was July 23, 1980, when Spencer Fuentes, a young farmer and devoted Protestant from Sylvana Lutheran Church, stumbled upon unidentified human remains in the well-known Stillaguamish River, the pride of Western Washington. Spencer, with his trousers rolled up above his knees, stood in the water, casting streamers and dry flies in hopes of catching a fish. In Arlington, fly fishing was quite the trend in those days. Spencer was at the Stillaguamish River on his blueberry and hazelnut farm, working on his skill as an angler. He was alone at the time when he caught a whiff of a stench. It was invasive but tolerable, and so he began looking around for the source. It must have been a dead animal, was what he thought to himself as he looked around the premises. And that is when he found something he would have never expected. He saw something floating between the logs at the riverbank, and when he walked closer to look, he saw a man's arm with his fingers dangling on the log, with the rest of his body submerged under the river. He didn't dare go any closer and hurried back to the nearest police station. The sheriff's deputy responded with skepticism as no one had reported someone missing, but he went with Spencer to speculate anyway. The deputy later confirmed it to be a body. Soon the backup arrived and they took the remains into custody. An investigation ensued and they began checking the perimeter. The deputies could only concur that it could have been anything. It could have been a suicide or maybe another fly fisherman enthusiast who met with an accident while swinging his fishing line. He was wearing a dark suit jacket and cotton pants, and all they had was 3 letters on the belt, G, R, and N, to work with. These could be the initials of his name, but could just as well be anything else. They determined the age of the deceased to be anywhere between 37 to 70. But that was too wide a range to work with. The river wasn't deep, and it certainly wasn't deep enough to drown. But it could still be a possibility, and the condition that the body was in made it certain that the person must have been dead for months. When a body is submerged in water for long periods of time, anything can happen. There could be predatory animals looking for food, and there could be bloating in the remains for the bacterial activities, putrefaction, and soft tissue discoloration. All of these factors make it hard for the investigators to identify the deceased and proceed further with the investigation. July is the warmest and driest month in Washington, and the temperature of the water could turn the skin into soapy fatty acids called grave wax. The only probable explanation they could infer was drowning, but it was later ruled out when the autopsy reports came in. Who performed the autopsy cited the cause to be apparently natural. The autopsy reports determined that the decedent had no signs of trauma or any signs of drowning. While they did find water in the lungs of the deceased, that was just because the person was in the water for a long time. But the reports had a section that could easily solve the mystery. The person had severe coronary artery disease, and that was much more likely the cause of his death. It is a fairly common disease among the elderly and those with diabetes, high blood pressure, and alcohol issues. A condition when the arteries that carry blood to the heart get hard and narrow. The case was solved, and it was not a murder. But who was this man? According to Dr. Haberman's report, the deceased was a male who stood 5 foot 7 inches tall and weighed about 150 pounds. They were not able to pinpoint an age, but he had gray hair, indicating he was on the older side. The deputies could not just take a picture and put it in the newspapers, as the face was barely recognizable. With very little to work with, they sought help from a dentist. Dr. Keith Leonard sifted through his dental records, comparing the deceased's teeth with the files of known missing persons. All efforts went in vain. With no hope, the Snohomish County Coroner's Office tagged the decedent as John Doe No. 2 and put the name in a file with a case number 80-7-526. About 3 weeks after the discovery of the decedent, on the 15th of August 1980, John Doe No. 2 was buried at the Arlington Cemetery by the Weller Funeral Home, but the deputies never stopped looking. It was a common practice to bury John Doe's or unidentified remains back then. But these days, the unidentified skeletal remains which are discovered are kept at the Snohomish County Medical Examiner's Office until they find the family. The skeletal remains were buried under a plot. The grave was marked John Doe 1980, which just seemed like a dignified, unmarked grave. The deputies were tirelessly working on the missing cases, comparing these John Does to many records of people who had vanished without a trace. It was 2008 when a cold case detective, Jim Scharf, from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, teamed up with a retired Superior Court judge of Snohomish County, Ken Calsert. When they finally had hope, they began reopening unsolved homicide cases and comparing them with all the John and Jane Does in Snohomish County. By then, DNA technology had evolved enough for them to be able to solve these cases, or at least partially identify them. But these unidentified people were already resting in their graves, and during the initial investigations, no DNA samples were taken. They wrote a permission letter to exhume the remains from the Arlington Municipal Cemetery, but the entire process of obtaining the exclamation permits and conducting the DNA testing could take years. In late 2017, while the world prepared for Christmas, the deputies and the representatives from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and the Medical Examiner's Office were at the Arlington Municipal Cemetery exhuming the remains from the grave. Some parts of the remains were taken to the Medical Examiner's Office for DNA extraction. They gathered these DNA from many. They had a lot of John Doe genome to work with, and so the Medical Examiner's I-5 Steely Doe. The process took time, and about 6 months later, in May 2018, this newfound DNA information was uploaded to National Missing and Unidentified Person Systems, or NamUs, a federal database that is funded by the National Institute of Justice. The database keeps a track of all the information of anyone missing, unidentified, and unclaimed from all around the nation. The database has dental records, fingerprints, and basically anything that can help them identify individuals. The database was still growing, and so after they had uploaded the details, all they could do was wait. NCIC, or National Crime Information Center database, is the FBI's database, which is a computerized index that keeps track of crimes and incidents, including missing person cases. Forensic odontologist Dr. Gary Bell took a dental radiograph of the decedent. Dubbed John Doe No. 2 charted the teeth and then uploaded them to NCIC, but that was again to no avail. But with the new advancements in technology, they had a lot of other ways to make it work. A month later, a forensic artist took all of the existing information on John Doe No. 2 and drew a facial reconstruction entirely based on facial morphology. The forensic artist, Natalie Murray, prepared a drawing that wasn't a photographic image, but an interpretation of the person based on the information provided. These drawings were meant to resemble the missing person and were made in hopes that someone might recognize the man. But that was to no avail. It had been 38 years since the body was discovered, and they must have thought it would take a miracle for someone to remember someone who they knew 38 years ago. Dr. Kathy Taylor stepped up and investigated further. They had almost everything on the man. With a forensic facial reconstruction by Natalie Murray and Dr. Kathy Taylor's estimation of the man based on the remains, this is what they had. The The man could be of Native American, Caucasian, or Hispanic origin. A 45 to 60-year-old man standing 5'9" with coronary artery disease. Although there was no perimortem trauma, the remains did indicate the man had damaged his ribs at some point of time in his life. There was evidence of well-healed rib and spinal compression fractures. The investigation had already taken too long. The sheriffs retired, but the search didn't. The researchers took a shot at mailing a section of a thigh bone, the femur, to the University of North Texas Health Sciences Center for DNA extraction and to be uploaded to CODIS, or Combined DNA Index System, is where all of the DNA information is stored and compared. CODIS aims to be the biggest DNA database. When the university obtained a full mtDNA and STR profile of the deceased, they uploaded them to CODIS. But that did not help either. It was normal for a DNA profile to not yield any matches, as the database was fairly new. In the following years, Snohomish County tried a number of methods, including going back to the files, matching and ruling out these new components like STR testing, dental records, and others. By 2021, genetic genealogy had gathered quite a name for itself. The method had provided positive results over the past 2 years, and they were able to identify several John Does. And this time, a fraction of I5 Stili Does thigh bone was sent for DNA extraction. They asked Othram Incorporated to prepare DNA profiles suitable for the Forensic Genetic Genealogy Database. The 41-year-old femur was in the Othram labs for about 5 months until they successfully obtained a sufficient DNA extraction after multiple rounds of extracts and enrichments. Finally, they managed to build a DNA profile that could be uploaded to the genealogical database. The Snohomish County Medical Examiner's Office uploaded the DNA profile received from Othram Incorporated to GEDmatch. It is a global database of DNA data, a free utility DNA site built for genetic genealogy research. Finally, there was a match, but it was a distant cousin. In a 5th to 7th range, there was a high chance that they might not even know the person. But this lead was enough to spark a new interest in the case. Building a usable family tree usually requires a second cousin match or something closer to establish a proper connection. A Ken forensics investigator, Deb Stone, began working on the case, and in May 2022, the Stili Doe profile was uploaded to a database called FamilyTreeEdna.com. This too yielded very low results, but what mattered was that there were new matches. These matches piled up together in a single family tree could perhaps finally solve the mystery of John Doe number 2. Deb Stone began putting 2 and 2 together, looking for family members near the areas where the body was first discovered. 42 years is a long time, and it was very unlikely for a distant cousin to remember someone from that many years ago. The woman she was going to meet had descendants in the state of Washington. This was a distant cousin, but a cousin. Nonetheless, when Deb Stone interviewed her, she recalled a relative who once told her about an uncle who went missing from Arlington back in the 1980s. The investigators finally had a name, Othniel Philip Ames, but that was a huge if. The Othniel they described was told to be 82 years old when he went missing, but the DNA profile and other reports estimated that the remains were of a person who must be in his 40s to 60s. For a DNA reference, they took DNA samples from a granddaughter, which ultimately was the nail in the coffin. John Doe number 2 and I5 Stili Doe were indeed Othniel Philip Ames. Dr. Matt Lacey, the chief medical examiner, officially identified John Doe number 2 as Othniel Philip Ames in September. Othniel told his family that he was going on a trip before he left, a month before his remains were found. He said he was going to take a tour of the country and meet his friends and relatives starting from the West Coast. It was much more likely to be a suicide case where an old man is gradually giving away everything he possesses. Before his disappearance, Othniel gave a Bible about the size of a passport to his grandniece Kay Taylor. She says that this was on Thursday, the 8th of January 1980, as it was written on the he gifted his old car, which was only worth a couple of $100s, to Diane Elledge and her husband. Elledge recalls Othniel whispering to them that he had hidden $20 somewhere in the car as an emergency fund. Othniel also gave them a vintage shotgun. While she did not know why he gave those things to her, her sister thinks it is because he liked the married couple as they had invited him to their wedding. Elledge said something very sad about Othniel. She said that he knew the end was near and he was very ill. He just went up into the woods to die there. Othniel also gave his house away to a nursing student who might have been his neighbor at the time. The irony here is how, in a press conference, Margaret Ames talks about Spencer and how they met. The young teen who discovered the remains of Othniel Philip Ames at the time, Spencer Margaret Ames, the daughter-in-law of Othniel Philip Ames. When she moved back to Savannah with her husband in the early 1990s, 10 years after the incident, she met Spencer Fuentes through the Lutheran Church, but they never talked about rivers or remains. Doug Ames, Othniel's grandson, took the day off work to meet Spencer Fuentes and his family. 1898 in Elwood, Iowa. He saw some of the worst days in his life as he was only 20 years old when World War I broke out. He lived in a small town called Bone Steel in South Dakota, and the entire town only had 600 people at the time. Othniel had to leave his hometown for better job opportunities and quality of life like many other young people living in Bone Steel. Today, only 249 people are living there. In 1929, he went on to marry Lydia Nuth, a 25-year-old woman, in a town with only a couple dozen residents at the time. A place called Cottonwood is located in South Dakota, and even today only 11 people live in the entire town. Life was hard, and the approaching stock market crash meant it was going to get harder. The shadows of war had engulfed the nation, and it was chaos everywhere, trying to survive. About 7 years later, the Ames family decided to move. The entire family moved across the country. A man, a pregnant wife, and their kids with a trailer latched onto their car. Othniel and his sons worked hard and built a farm on 22 acres of land. The family kept 7 dairy cows and Othniel became a milkman. Lydia would cook on a wood stove and Othniel would milk the cows and farm. Those days life wasn't as easy as it is now, and the war made it even harder. Apart from farming, Othniel also had a lathe in his basement where he would carve salt and pepper shakers, among other things which he would just give away. Othniel also began working at a shingle mill, and when he had time to spare, he'd make dandelion wine. He wasn't the type to sit around, he always kept himself busy. Life taught him the hard way, and he grew up to be a stern man. But life wasn't easy, and it was as though he was always looking for reasons to be happy, always looking for a way to distract himself. Tragedy struck when one of their daughters died in a car crash while she was on her way to her 10th high school reunion. Even though they never had an official divorce, the married couple got separated sometime in the 1960s. The family was in fragments as both the sons joined the military when they were teenagers. One of them served in the Air Force and married a young Norwegian woman in Savannah. After the separation, the Ames family sold their farm, but most importantly their home, which they built after facing so much hardship. Lydia moved to Everett and Othniel went on to live in a small cabin in the woods, all alone somewhere near Arlington, along the Ebbe Mountain Road. He had a very minimal lifestyle, and all he had with him was his pet dog, who knew how to close doors by backing into them. I guess it's safe to say he was an avid outdoorsman. There he grew dahlias and kept to himself. He was a loner and all he wanted was peace. The log cabin was comfortable enough for one person even though he did not have an indoor bathroom, but he had hollowed out a huge stump to compensate for it. He spent the last of his days at the log cabin along with his dog. The last time Diana Lidge saw him, he was ill. It was evident during the autopsy that he had severe coronary artery disease. In his last moments, he knew it was the end, and so he chose to leave silently. It is ironic how Margaret Ames is around the same age now as Othniel Ames was when they finally found him. This case shows how modern ways of life have created a huge gap between parents and children. Othniel chose to stay alone and away from everyone, even during the times when he needed someone to stay beside the most, as he did not want to be a burden. A 19-year-old girl, Linda, didn't show up for breakfast and then lunch one day. When they sent her brother Howard to check up on her, he saw something that would scar him for life. Why did Linda not come home for breakfast? Did she oversleep? What did Howard see? We are going to reveal a case which was buried under a thick layer of snow about half a century ago. The snow has now finally melted, is now behind bars. Come with us as we look at what exactly happened on the fateful day of a cold February back in 1978. February is the month when Buffalo, New York's second largest city, gets the highest amount of snowfall, and this is where our case today takes us. It is located at the head of the Niagara River across the Canadian border from southern Ontario. Linda Tashari was a bartending student living alone in the family cottage, a little behind the larger home where the rest of her family resided. Even though she lived alone at the guest house, she was always in contact with everyone. Well, she only lived about 5 minutes away. As Howard, her brother, described her, she was the one who the family members talked to if they had problems. She liked to keep the family together. It was the 8th of February, 1978. It was past noon. Her lunch was cold, and when Linda's brother went over to the cottage to fetch her, the doors were invitingly open. When he entered the cottage, he was greeted by a scene so horrifying that it would scar him forever, or at least for 44 years. The house was warm, and no one dared open a window. Buffalo was in the grips of a blizzard, and there was no one outside. The streets were empty, and everything was covered in a blanket of snow. It was 8 in the morning on the 8th of February, 1978. Linda's family, her mom and her brother, saw someone walking away from the cottage behind their home and getting into a green Chevrolet Nova parked across the street from their house. He was a man who was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, wearing a ski cap and a navy blue coat. Howard Tashari, Linda's brother, assumed the person was Linda's boyfriend. Who else could it be? He must have stayed the night and just had to get home early. The day went rather normally, but it seemed like Linda had overslept. She wasn't there for breakfast. It was lunchtime when Linda's mother sent Howard, who was 18 at the time, to wake her up. Linda would normally come to the main house to check her mail, but she hadn't that day, which concerned her mother. She sent Howard to check up on her, and when he went to the cottage, he found the side door was unlocked. He pushed the door as it creaked open. The sound of the radio was the first thing he noticed as he stepped inside. As he made his way towards the hallway, he spotted blood stains on the floor. He knew something was dreadfully wrong as he went deeper into the room. He was horrified to find his sister in her pajamas lying lifeless, staring at him in a pool of blood on the living room floor next to the doorway to her bedroom. Howard, trembling as he stuttered her name, knelt beside her as her ice-cold body stared at him. He was frozen for a moment with a million thoughts running through his mind. How could he break this news to his mother? But he had to. He went back and explained what he saw. They called the police. They knew it was the stranger, but he had been too far away for them to identify the man. In the hours after Linda was found fatally stabbed, the Buffalo police detectives began their investigation and gathered evidence from the crime scene. At the time, the area was covered in snow. The police officers who arrived at the crime scene found a trail of blood leading away from the cottage. This led investigators to believe that the killer had injured himself somehow. With limited resources, they had very little to work with. The Buffalo Police Department notified local hospitals and medical stores in the hopes that the killer would seek medical attention to tend to his wounds. The entire cottage was filled with DNA evidence, with the killer's blood splattered on several rooms and on several items, including a Grand Funk Railroad vinyl record cover. Linda has been stabbed 13 times and had wounds on her face, neck, and back. Linda has bruises on her face, abdomen, and arm, which were sustained at the time of the murder. The autopsy revealed that Linda died of blood loss. The police worked through the usual suspects, speaking to Linda's boyfriend, her stepfather, and the handyman, but nothing came up, and soon they were out of clues and no arrests were made. The motive of the murder was ruled to likely be a robbery gone wrong. The killer had seen the cottage away from the main home. This attracted him, but when he entered the cottage, he saw a 19-year-old sleeping there. Wanting to steal things, he moved around the cottage looking for precious items to take. But it all failed when Linda woke up, and in the commotion he had no other option but to kill the witness. But the question remained. Who was the mystery man who was leaving the cottage that morning? Who was the man in that navy blue coat who got into a green Chevrolet Nova? With no other leads, the case went cold. All of the evidence collected in the case, including the DNA evidence, was eventually packaged in 39 envelopes and bags stacked into boxes put away in storage about 2 months after the crime. Even though the killer had fled the crime scene, he had left his DNA. Back in the 1980s, DNA analysis did not exist. It was determined that the blood found at the crime scene was a different blood type from that of Linda. The cold case squad began looking into the case again in 2006, and the detectives sent about 40 pieces of evidence to Erie County Central Police Service's forensic laboratory for analysis. Knew the DNA evidence was the key to the killer, but the technology wasn't advanced enough to decipher it back then. But when the technology was upgraded in April 2016, the family members contacted a homicide detective who was on the cold case squad, seeking help. The detective tracked down 14 other men whose names were in the original case file, as well as others who might have known Linda around the time she was killed. These were Linda's stepfather, a couple of men who lived in the neighborhood at the time, and an old boyfriend. There was also a man who helped Linda's sister move. All of them willingly submitted their DNA profile, and they were all ruled out as the killer by the detectives. The team began developing DNA profiles with the blood collected from the crime scene. But the DNA wasn't complete, and so they could only create a partial DNA profile. There were parts of genetic information missing, making it complicated. A partial DNA profile is a profile made from a sample, which is considered to be partial and does not have enough genetic materials available to sample. The sample could have degraded over time, and the information might not be as accurate as they want it to be. That was exactly the reason why these two DNA samples from the crime scene were not allowed to be uploaded to the National DNA Database. But the rules and the standards changed 3 years later in 2019. The lab staff uploaded all the DNA data they had in their possession, including the ones from the crime scene. And the next day, they had the face of the killer. The National DNA Database had a match, and it came from Oregon. They finally had a name: John Soberin. This felt too good to be true, and so they cross-checked him with the original case file, but his name did not appear anywhere. Soberin had to have lived in the area in Buffalo at the time of the homicide. They went through the file again and from the testimony given by Linda's mother, and they found that the suspect had driven a green Chevrolet Nova. That was enough for them to zero in on the suspect. The detectives asked for the records from the Department of Motor Vehicles to see people who owned the described vehicle. And even if they did not find John Soberin, they did find people who were connected to Soberin. The first address was to a woman with whom Soberin had a child, and the second one was registered to Soberin's adoptive mother in Tonawanda. It was enough for the detectives to determine that Soberin lived around the area at the time of the murder. The records also showed that he had lived in many other states since the 1980s, including Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Arizona, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Ohio, which earned him the name the Drifter. When the investigators took Soberin in for something that happened in the 1970s, he immediately asked for a lawyer. At the arrest, the county forensic lab performed additional DNA analysis on the original crime scene evidence, which included the bloodstains on the sleeves of the Grand Funk Railroad album, and the analysis report was consistent with Soberin's DNA. Back in the 70s, Soberin was nicknamed Chief the Thief. He was known to steal bicycles. He also has been arrested in relation to an incident involving property damage. He had been charged with robbery. There were a lot of coincidences that fit in perfectly. It was very likely that he was the man that Tashari saw walking away from the cottage that morning. He also had a green Chevrolet Nova. The crime scene looked like a robbery gone wrong. He took pride in his stealing ventures, and the case of Linda could be one of the unfortunate ones where he broke into the cottage, but unexpectedly there was somebody inside. And to eliminate the witness, he took the drastic step of becoming a murderer. On the 11th of October this year, the jury found Soberin guilty of second-degree murder, and the prosecution and the defense both agreed that the victim and the murderer did not know each other. Soberin faces a maximum of 25 years to life as he awaits sentencing on the 13th of December. Do you think if they had stopped the man walking away that they would have at least known what had happened in the cottage? Maybe he would have tried to escape, and it would still have taken 4 decades for them to find justice. Maybe they could have got to Linda sooner and saved her. But at least now, all these years later, the family has closure on what happened. The 4 young women had similar backgrounds and were all working as sex workers when they were murdered. Their bodies were found packaged and dumped in different places around the area. These women were supposedly picked up from a part of Cherokee Street in St. Louis, Missouri, known as the Southside Stroll by sex workers. One of them was 19-year-old Robin J. Milhan, who had recently given birth to her second child 2 weeks before she went missing. Her brother Tom remembered her as a lively young woman. Sadly, she got addicted to crack cocaine during the 90s like many others. She had 2 children, with her second child being put up for adoption. Her older child lived with her uncle Tom Meehan, who was also struggling with crack addiction. Robin faced many challenges due to poverty and addiction, leading her to turn to sex work. She was last seen on March 22, 1990, on Cherokee Street, according to another sex worker. The police later confirmed that she was picked up from there and taken to the killer's residence where she was murdered. Her family reported her missing, and her body was discovered 4 days later around 60 miles northwest of St. Louis in a rural town. Her body was found wrapped between 2 mattresses held together by coat hangers on Highway E in Silex, Missouri. Her head was wrapped in a shirt, which had sweat marks on it. There were also traces of dog hair, but DNA evidence couldn't be extracted at that time, as the technology was still in its infancy. The investigators determined that she had been strangled. There was also a condom wrapper found with the body. Tom tries to block the dark memory and describes his sister as a good person. He says he just misses her now as he looks at her daughter, whom he raised. Brenda Jean Pruitt, 27, was the mother of a young child. She lived just a few blocks from the Cherokee Stroll. Brenda was reported missing by her family on May 9, 1990, just 48 days after Robin's disappearance was reported. For 10 months after her disappearance, there were no answers. Brenda had a troubled past, with multiple charges of burglary and suspected robbery against her in the same year and in 1985. She was found on October 4th of that same year. However, her body was so badly mutilated and decomposed that she remained unidentified for 5 months until March 5, 1991. A jogger on Boston Drive in Maryland Heights complained of a foul smell emanating from among the weeds. Workers searched the area and found the decomposing body in a 33-gallon plastic trash bin amidst other trash. Her murder was instantly linked to 2 already open cases: Robin Meehan and Donna Rietmeyer. Both women were sex workers, and the Major Crimes Division investigation moved in the direction of a serial killer targeting prostitutes in that area. Donna Rietmeyer, 40, was the mother of 3 young girls, ranging in age between 13 and their late 20s at the time. A known sex worker and addict, she was reported missing by her friend Sheila Leach. As per Leach's account, Rietmeyer and she had been dropped off at the Stroll, and later Donna left to meet a client. They were supposed to meet up later that night, but Donna never showed up. Leach inquired about her at her house, but found that she hadn't been there either. Donna was reported a month after Brenda's disappearance, and like Brenda's, her body was found in a rubber trash can on June 11, 1990. Her daughters, Juanita Zills and Rhonda Sullivan, were just teenagers about the time and did not quite understand their mother's struggle with addiction. Both girls have very distant yet fond memories of their mother. They remember her as a kind and beautiful soul who was always loving to them and helpful to whomever she met. Donna had her first child when she was 15 and after was married to her 17-year-old high school boyfriend. She moved out after 2 years and started another family. Rhonda continued to live with her father. Zills was also brought up by her father and her mother's family from the age of 6. She describes her as a giving person. Zills has a similar account of some motherly advice on regular moisturizing when she once visited her in jail. They also remember her addiction. Zills had just reconnected with her mother before her death, and she was devastated with her passing. Dawn, her 3rd child, refused to speak out. A 4th disappearance of a young mother followed just 3 months later. Sandy Little, a 21-year-old mother of 1. Sandy had a tough childhood bouncing between foster homes as her mother could not take care of her. She rebelled against any kind of authority and could not keep a job. Her aunt, Diane Little, got custody of Sandy when she was just 15 or 16. Her stepsister, Barb Stutt, remembers Sandy as a fun, loud, and extremely lively person. According to Diane, Sandy only spent a year with her before she fell into a bad crowd and started using drugs. When she turned to prostitution to support her habit, she had to move out. She disappeared for a bit, and when she came back on the radar, she had a baby. After she gave birth to her child, she lived with her boyfriend on top of an antique shop and worked the stroll as a prostitute. The antique shop owner remembered her vividly and said she was a very sweet girl and that she would never have left her child. She went missing on September 4th, 1990, by a driver on his way to work just west of Highway 79 on the shoulder of Interstate 70. Her remains were packed into a wooden drawer with a wool cap pulled over her face. Her body had to be identified by comparing the remains of an old X-ray of a fractured arm that she had sustained while alive. She was buried in an unmarked grave donated to the family because they could not afford to bury her. She remains in that unmarked grave to this day. This solidified the fact that the St. Louis police had a serial killer on their hands and that he or she lived in the St. Louis area. The FBI got involved in the case as early as June 1991 and confirmed the work of a serial killer. They profiled the package killer then as a sexual sadist who goes after younger women he can control. They also surmised that he would be a loner, divorced, working menial jobs, and with a poor work record. A veteran St. Louis homicide sergeant was one of the earliest investigators on the case, and he had observed the pattern where the killer dumped the bodies in the night and also made a point to do so across police jurisdictions. There was to be one final victim that would finally put this killer away for life: Kenneth "Dog" Atchison. Atchison was a construction worker who was out of work due to bad arthritis. He started doing odd jobs around town. The killer hired him for a project at his home. Both men were regulars at the Overland Diner and knew each other well, even sharing meals together. The two were said to have had a small altercation over the dimensions of the materials purchased, and Atchison left without doing the job. This left the killer miffed. Later, he lured Atchison in with the sale of a Cadillac for an amount of $6,000. The family reported that Atchison, 57, left to meet his murderer at his Bell Ridge home on February 8, 1993, driving to it in his 1987 Chrysler. Atchison planned to exchange his Chrysler and the money for the Cadillac. His family later reported him missing. The police did not take the reporting seriously as they believed Atchison had fled with the money. The family, especially Atchison's brother Vernon, did some sleuthing of his own. They found the Chrysler being driven by a woman who had connections to the suspect. Also, the family time and again requested the Overland police to search the house he had been headed to, but to no avail. 6 weeks later, Atchison's body was recovered from the basement of the house in a makeshift coffin. This was 2 years and 5 months after Little went missing. Each crime was followed by its own trail of reporting, finding, and identification, but the killer himself remained a mystery, hidden behind a nickname, the Package Killer. It could not in any way be connected back to the previous 4 homicides. Atchison's case was investigated as a solitary crime. Since the family found no cooperation with the Overland police, they got the St. Louis police involved. Overland Police Chief Eddie Williams maintains that the case was investigated as a suspicious disappearance, and they had questioned the suspect. They found minimal evidence for a search warrant. On March 25, 1993, the police got a tip-off from an informant, which led to a search of the house. As Jones recounts, it was a 45-day ordeal, which ended in the recovery of her father's body in a makeshift coffin in the killer's basement. Ron Solanskis was a security guard at the Overland Diner the killer frequented. He later went on to testify that the killer approached him to move a box in his basement, but when he arrived there, he noticed Atchison's shoe sticking out. He left in a hurry and did not report this for the fear of being arrested for murder. The body of Atchison was later found in the box. He'd been strangled, battered, and finally shot. 3520 East Edgar Drive at Bell Ridge was home to Gary Muehlberg and was also the place where he butchered all of his victims. One of 3 children, Muehlberg had a history of violence from a very young age. He was born in St. Louis, but his family moved to Kansas at some point. He married and had 1 child there. Later, in 1972, he was charged with kidnapping, battery, and rape. This was followed by a series of other offenses. As Weber, the chief investigator on this case, states, her effort to understand the killer took her down a very dark road. According to a report Weber pulled from Salina, Kansas, Muehlberg once tied up and gagged a 14-year-old babysitter while she was on the job. He apparently did this with an intention but left quite abruptly, leaving her bound and gagged. He did time in prison for this. Associates also described Muehlberg as a twice-divorced narcissist. He studied psychology at the Central Methodist University and also completed graduation at Central Missouri State. There was a brief phase of stability where he married again and moved back to St. Louis with his wife's family. The marriage eventually failed and 2 kids from the marriage passed away. The neighbors remember him as a nasty know-it-all who always gave out evil vibes. Some of them said they were surprised at the revelation and say they knew Atchison was not his only victim. There's one neighbor who remembers him standing through a fence as construction work was going on next door and giving the workers instructions. He behaved like he knew better than anyone else. Detective Sergeant Jody Weber of O'Fallon Police Department reopened the case in 2008. In 2003, when Jody Weber was a newbie detective, she heard stories about the Sandy Little case. Weber was very interested in solving cold cases, and she pored over this one and read about its connection to the 3 other cases. She saw the pictures and simply could not get them out of her head. She understood that none of the cases were DNA tested because such tools were not available to the police in the early 90s. A determined Weber traveled between the stations to collect evidence from the Meehan and Pruitt cases as well. Weber pulled evidence bags and sent them to a Missouri Highway Patrol lab for DNA testing. She was determined to find answers for the family. Unfortunately, in 2008, when the results came in, no match was found in the database. Weber had no intention of quitting, though. She and her fellow detectives interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses, families, and she once again sent the evidence to be DNA tested, and this time it was to the St. Charles County Crime Lab. The lab was eventually able to get a partial DNA profile off the condom found with the body of Robin Meehan. The profile was not substantial enough to be entered into the CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, but it was used to rule out suspects. Due to the backlog of cases in the lab, and also with priority given to newer cases, this took 14 years of patient waiting to resolve. Finally, after 32 years, there was a match. Gary Muehlberg. Weber searched through the history of the killer. She found everything fit in like a puzzle coming together. Muehlberg was serving life for Atchison's murder. The similarities between all the murders was startling. Atchison's body was found in a makeshift coffin just like the girls whose bodies were all packaged. Muehlberg kept Atchison's body with him for around 6 weeks, and as it turns out, he'd also kept the bodies of the girls in the basement of his home before disposing of them. Weber, along with Mark Harvey, an investigator for the prosecutor's office of St. Charles County, finally came face to face with the killer in person. They showed him the crime scene pictures, to which he faked shock and disdain. He denied having anything to do with it at first. A month later, Weber, together with 4 prosecutors this time, met Muehlberg once again. At this time, they came to an agreement. There would be no change to his condition in jail. They would not seek the death penalty so long as he cooperated. She just wanted the truth. Muehlberg then confessed to all the crimes one by one. The second interview was pretty powerful, Weber said. She added, he said he's thought a lot about these cases. He said his remaining time in prison would be easier getting this off his chest. He admitted to being lost and said that he did not really understand why he did what he did during that dark phase of his life. Additionally, Muehlberg confessed to another murder of a still unidentified woman, whom he claims to have left in a metal barrel outside of a car wash. He has not been charged with that murder. When asked if he thought the prostitutes deserved such an end, he said that he had acquaintances with other prostitutes whom he had not killed. He simply couldn't explain why he chose those particular women. He was quoted as saying, "No matter how these victims choose to make a living, they should not have had their lives taken in such a dark way." Gary Muehlberg, now 73, remains in prison serving a life sentence and is suffering from kidney failure. As Robin Meehan's brother Tom put it, "What I'm most happy about is that the man has been incarcerated since 1993. The families are trying to find comfort in the fact that he was not able to harm anyone else since his incarceration." Why do you think it took 32 years for the dots to finally be connected? Was it because the women were all sex workers and drug addicts? Who was the unknown woman left at the car wash? Are there any more women who remain unknown or unfound? Located in Colorado's southeast corner, Springfield is the home to a population of over 1,000 people. Known as a farming and ranching community, this statutory town is the most populated town situated on the county seat of Baca County. But Springfield had no clue that a mystery on its land in 1988 would take the next 34 years to get solved. On June 3, 1988, Baca County Sheriff's Office responded to a call from a Colorado farm. A local farmer reported to the Baca County Sheriff's Office that he had found what he believed to be human remains on his farm, located approximately 20 miles southeast of the town of Springfield, Baca County, Colorado. The open field was passed by truck drivers on a regular basis. When then Sheriff Willard Goff and then Coroner Robert Morrow, along with other deputies, searched the scene, they confirmed the remains as human remains. On the property, they found scattered human remains, which were in a degraded skeletal condition. The remains consisted of what was most of the human skeleton. The bones were not all there, and what was there was white and bleached, with part of the spine still connected. The remains were then sent to the coroner's office for an autopsy, while the investigators scanned the area for clues. Unfortunately, they could not find any evidence that could lead them to unmask the victim's identity. People from the Baca County Coroner's Office, as well as the Sheriff's Office, spent several days searching the farm with the assistance of the farm operator. They documented several items found on the property and screened the soil in the area of the search of potential evidence. However, nothing was found to be able to identify the remains or to assist in determining how or why the person had died, or how they could have ended up in the farmer's field. The remains were unrecognizable, and authorities tried in vain to come up with any significant information that could lead them to unmask the identity of the individual. Forensic examination concluded the remains belonged to a female victim who was believed to be between the ages of 19 and 24. She stood between 5 foot 2 inches and 5 foot 4 inches, and weighed around 130 pounds. Her hair was brown, but her eye color could not be determined due to the remains being in a degraded condition. She was wearing gray corduroy Levi jeans with the leg cuffs hemmed up to 27.5-inch inseam, a beige-colored winter coat with a white synthetic fur collar and 4-inch fur cuffs, and a 34B bra. A single quarter dating to 1986 was found in her pocket. Forensics could not confirm the ancestry of the victim. She bore traits of Hispanic or Latino people, Native American and European people. She had extensive dental work, including 2 silver cast crowns, 1 upper and 1 lower on the left side, which indicated that she might be from Mexico or had lived along the border of Mexico. The internals of her body suggest that she might have never given birth. It was also concluded that she had died approximately 1 to 3 years before her remains were discovered, and the nature of her death was ruled as suspicious, most likely a homicide. As the victims remained unidentified, authorities at the same time were unable to track down any of her relatives to hand down her remains to her family. With the unavailability of a name, the victim was named as the Baca County Jane Doe. In 2005, Jane Doe, along with copies of case information, was buried in the Springfield Cemetery, while all the original records of her death were kept at the sheriff's and coroner's office. Despite not having any significant evidence about the death of the Baca County Jane Doe, authorities did not give up in their attempts to solve the case. Over the years, multiple attempts were made to identify her. Dental impressions were made and dental records of the victim were submitted to the National Crime Information Center to try to obtain a match within the missing persons database. DNA samples were also taken and submitted for analysis, even though DNA was in its infancy at the time when it came to identifying victims. An anthropological study was conducted on the remains to gather information about any possible evidence on the body that could lead to its identification, to get an idea of what the person might have looked like. Even the filings in her teeth were analyzed in an attempt to determine the previous location of the deceased before her death. Many possible matches, including potential dental matches, were received, but as the investigation progressed, each potential match was ruled out after comparison with the remains. Investigators also held press conferences sharing details about this case and urging the public to come forward with any knowledge they might have about the victim. But nothing was drawn from that, and no one came forward. Despite the diligent efforts of the investigators, the deceased remained unidentified, and the case turned cold. After remaining unsolved for over 3 decades, finally, in 2021, the case got unexpected assistance and was sent in a new direction. The Baca County Sheriff's and Coroner's Office were contacted by an investigative intern working for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The person asked for permission to submit the data from the 1988 Baca County Jane Doe case into NAMAS, a national database of missing and unidentified persons, as well as a resource center for families to find their missing relatives, which was launched in 2007. It did not bring an immediate result, but the case got renewed attention, which also brought up other resources. Combining their resources with the Baca County Coroner's Office, Baca County Sheriff Aaron Shiplett hoped to get a breakthrough in the case of this Jane Doe. Multiple people from the Sheriff's Office and Coroner's Office spent time combining the relevant case information from both agencies' case files into the Sheriff's Office database using the original documents, which were almost 34 years old. After uploading all the information, several detectives were appointed to analyze it. On the other hand, Shiplett was also trying to contact a genetic genealogy lab, as he was hopeful that advances in technology could potentially identify Jane Doe. In July 2021, the Baca County Coroner's Office made contact with Solved by DNA, which is a Castle Rock-based genetic genealogy company, in an attempt to identify the Baca County Jane Doe. This company possesses expertise in investigative genetic genealogy and advanced DNA testing of crime scene DNA or DNA from unidentified human remains. After developing a DNA profile from the unidentified DNA, they used traditional genealogical research to predict whether a suspect or an unidentified person may fit into a family tree based on numerous DNA databases. However, an obstruction was already on its way to solving the case. Although Jane Doe had her DNA records in the original files of investigations, due to the limitations in technology available at the time, those records were not adequate to do a familial DNA study, and new DNA samples were needed to conduct the investigation. On December 13, 2021, an investigative team of the Baca County Sheriff's Office, led by Shiplett, exhumed the remains of Jane Doe from the Springfield Cemetery and obtained new samples of familial DNA testing and research before reburying remains. The samples were then delivered to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in Pueblo for analysis. After a brief analysis, the CVI entered the new DNA profile into NAMAS. In August of 2022, the Baca County Sheriff's Office and Baca County Coroner's Office learned about a possible familial DNA match. Solved by DNA notified the Sheriff's Office that they had been able to locate a person through their DNA research. That could be a possible family member of Jane Doe. The Baca County Sheriff's Office soon began their process of tracking down and contacting several other possible family members of the match, and was able to get them in touch with Solved by DNA. Solved by DNA then requested them to submit their own DNA for analysis, which was necessary to determine if the Baca County Jane Doe was related to them. As family members agreed, Solved by DNA initiated the process of obtaining their DNA for the necessary research. A month later, on September 26, 2022, the Baca County Sheriff's Office was notified by NAMAS regarding their discovery of a separate familial DNA match for Jane Doe. The match was linked to a person who lived in Texas and had submitted their DNA to the McAllen Police Department in Texas in 2004 in an attempt to search for missing mother, Nora Alia Castillo. Nora's daughter, Josie Castillo, was the one who submitted her DNA to the McAllen Police Department in the process of locating her missing mother. The missing person report of Nora Castillo was filed in 1996, even though she had been missing since 1986 or 1987. According to the report of the McAllen Police Department, the last contact with Nora Castillo was a collect call from somewhere in Colorado shortly before her disappearance. After further DNA testing and analysis, the identity of Baca County Jane Doe was finally confirmed as Nora Castillo. Josie Castillo could not spend much time with her mom while growing up since she lived with her dad. Despite that, she remembered her being an outgoing person who loved to laugh and smile. But Josie also remembered how social services got involved when she was 6 and her sister Crystal was 3. At a time when Nora was going through some issues, Nora attempted to get them while they lived in New Mexico with their dad. But getting into some trouble led her to the jail in Hobbs, New Mexico. From there, it said that she went to a mental institution, and that was the last time anyone ever saw from her. 4 years after their mother's mysterious disappearance, the daughters wondered about Nora's whereabouts and how she could be found. The Baca County Sheriff's Office stated, after almost 36 years, the family of Nora Alia Castillo finally knows where she is. Her sister Crystal was also notified about their mother's final fate. Although their hope of ever getting their mother alive was shattered, they were happy to have a sense of closure after all these years of waiting. All this came out of absolutely nowhere, and it's a lot, Crystal stated. Despite seeking answers regarding what led to her mother's untimely demise, Josie said she can now go to sleep at night knowing where her mom is, thanks to genetic genealogy. My heart is healing. There's a healing process now, Josie stated. Nora's family has since been able to visit Nora's last resting place and even the location where she was discovered. However, authorities are still unaware of what happened to Lee to Castillo's death. The details of how Nora Alia Castillo died or why she was in Colorado are still under investigation. For now, this case is still being investigated as a potential homicide. Baca County Deputy Coroner Everett Brissendine said, "We're hoping we would get some kind of tip that would lead us to knowing more about why and how she died." After 3 decades of remaining as a Jane Doe, Nora finally reunited with her family. But even in death, she is still deprived of justice. If anyone out there knows anything, do not hesitate to come forward, as your information could be invaluable to unmask the murderer. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.